Hey class, in this video we're going to try making something useful. So far we've used JavaScript to create variables, to query the DOM, to save things, and now we're going to put all that together to build a tool that is, a little bit more interesting than just changing colors on the screen or saying if a number is even or odd. So what I want to do is build an area calculator. So I created a brand new Codepen, and I'm going to open up the console so that I can see it. And I'm actually going to start with JavaScript here. So the first thing I want to do is write a program that calculates the area of a shape. So area is length times height, I believe. So I'm going to write function area, and inside the parentheses, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to provide arguments. So we're going to pass the length and the height to the area. So I said arguments, but that was the wrong word. When I'm defining a function, the stuff in the parentheses here, these are variables that are going to become available to the body of my function. And L and H stand for length and height. These are what are called parameters. So when I'm defining the function, these are the parameters of my function, length and height. My function needs these two things in order to do what it's supposed to do. If we call the function without length and height, then it's going to fail. Okay, so what I want to do now is return length times height. I can test this in the console by typing area and then giving it two numbers. So let's say 5 and 5, which should give me 25, and it does. Okay, so how can I make this program usable by somebody who comes to my web page? Now I'm going to need to build a user interface for my function. So let's start with the inputs. So we're going to create an input, and we will call this input length. We're going to create another input, and this one is going to be the height. Here we go. Next, we'll need a button that can send our input to the function. So the user will type in the values here, and then we'll send the input to the function. Here we go. Okay, so now that I have this, let's neaten it up a little bit. It's pretty, it's pretty boring looking. So let's add some stuff to our inputs to make them a little bit easier to use. So first of all, the type. These are numbers, so let's change it to the number type. And we'll see that the input now has these little arrows up and down, and we can add numbers. We can also add negative numbers, and I don't like that. So what I'm going to do is change the min value for the input to 1. Let's change this min to 1 as well. Now, if I try to go below 1, I can't. The input doesn't really allow me to do that. Okay, so that's done. Let's add some labels. We haven't done that yet. So neither of these inputs have the name attribute, but let's go ahead and give them both a name. So the name attribute is important when you're dealing with forms, and this isn't really a true form, but because we're going to use the label attribute, we're going to need the name attribute. You might be going, what does that even mean? Okay, so now that we have our names added to our input, it's just another way for the browser to identify these two inputs. So we know that they're inputs, and we know that they're both of type number, and they have these IDs. Well, I spelled this wrong. But they also have names. And if I add a label, label is a little piece of text that is usually next to the input or above it, or sometimes below it, that identifies what the input is for. So let's say length, and then we're going to add another one down here. There we go. And this is height. And then you'll notice that when I used Emmet to create the label automatically, there's this little attribute here called for. So this label is for this input. And the name here, length, is how we identify that thing. So if I put the same exact name in the for attribute, I guess the biggest advantage is now when I click on length, the focus shifts to the input. Over here, I haven't added the for attribute, so when I click on height, nothing really happens. It selected it there, but it doesn't put the focus inside the input the way that length does right now. So I can either click in the box or I can click on the label, and now the cursor is in there. And that's really useful, especially on mobile where things are kind of small and you're trying to tap on inputs with your fingers. It's easy to click on the label to access the input a lot of times. Okay, so let's add the for attribute for our height. And now when I click on height, it shifts the focus to that input. Okay, so I've got my nice little setup here. Let's also add a break here, just so that it puts length and height on different lines. And then let's add another break after the last input so that the button is on its own line. This looks pretty good. I can add maybe some colons or something, and they're a little off center, but it's fine. We would use CSS to fix that. So I could take my inputs and I could adjust their width, or I could adjust the button. I could add I could add margin and padding around these things, but I'm going to skip all that for right now, and I'm just going to work on my functionality. So in the calc area button, we're going to add the on-click attribute, and we're going to run not area, but we're going to run a function that we haven't created yet called calc area. And then down in our JavaScript, we're going to create a function for calc area next. And this function is actually going to call the area function. And what we're going to do here is create variables to retrieve the input data from HTML, and then we're going to pass them to our area function. So we're going to use the query selector function again, and because we're selecting by ID, we're going to use hashtag length, and then we're going to do the same thing on the next line for the height, document.querySelector, hashtag height. And then finally, we can call the area function. But let's create a variable to save the result of our area function. We'll call it A, and we'll set it equal to area. And we're going to pass L and H to it. Now, what should we do with this once we get our value? Let's just console.log it for now. We'll log A. And actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add these curly brackets here. I'm going to log L, H, and A. And what this is going to do is it's going to print out the values for L, H, and A, but it's going to be a slightly different syntax. So let's see how that looks in our console. Let me clear out those errors. And I'm going to put 5 and 5. And I'm going to calculate the area, and I got null. So This is a common thing. I use document.querySelector to get the length, but I did not put the value property here, which is what I really want. I don't want the entire input this time. I know in the other videos I was creating query selectors to get the input, and then from that I was getting the value. But in this one, I'm just going to store the values themselves. I don't need the entire input. So let's just clear out that error and try it again. This time I'm going to put 5 by 4, and I can see that the length is 5, the 4 is, the height is 4, and the area is 20. So notice that the syntax is different. We're getting an object because in JavaScript, objects are curly brackets followed by key value pairs, and we have a series of keys with their values. So we have L is 5, H is 4, and A is 20. This makes debugging our little programs nice and clean. We can see not just the values but also the variable names. So the area is 20, but notice that 4 and 5 are surrounded by quotes. So 4 and 5 are strings, and when we pass it to our function, we're getting a number back. So that's kind of interesting. If I just change this function so that it adds L and H instead of multiplying it, I try this again. Now I wouldn't get the correct area, obviously, but I get 76. And what's happening here is concatenation. We're taking the 7 and the 6 and we're joining them together like they were letters in a word. So because we're using multiplication, JavaScript is trying to convert these, it's going to convert these into numbers on the fly, because it wouldn't make sense to number strings. And sometimes in some languages you can use this syntax with strings and it will just output many versions of that string. I cannot multiply a string times a number. In other languages it might say foo twice, right? So in this one, in JavaScript, it does not do that. So anyway, it's always important to try different things to see what the problems might be in your code. This input doesn't let me type in a word. Now there's ways to fix that, to get around that, to sort of hack the program, but I'm not worried about that right now. This is good enough. I can put a positive number into these inputs and I press calculate and I can see that I'm getting the area down here. This is great, but wouldn't it be nice to see that result on screen? So let's go into our HTML real quick and let's add a space for the message to print out, so the area to actually print out. I'm going to add a class, or let's add an ID. We're using IDs. Let's add an ID to this. ID equals message, which is the term we've been using so far for the output of our programs. And then right here, what I'm going to do is a little bit of a shortcut. I'm going to use document.querySelector again, but I'm not going to save the result. I'm just going to access it directly. Document.querySelector. And I'm going to access hashtag message. And that's our div up there. So I'm going to say dot inner text. And I'm just going to set that to A. Okay, so now if I save this and I run 5 times 6, I get to calculate the area of 30. So there's our little area calculator. In the next video, we'll probably build on this a little bit more. So make sure you save your work. And let me know if you have problems with your code. If you need help, send me a link to your Codepen. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.